Welcome, boys and girls, to Lesson 9, Race Relations 1957 to 1979. We're picking up basically at the end of the Notting Hill riots and looking at if things improved or got worse in Britain.
They got worse.
Spoiler alert. A couple key words for you. First and foremost is the Commonwealth. Obviously, going back to our first lesson, countries which were previously part of the British Empire form what are known as the Commonwealth of Nations. Integration, that's the mixing of different communities. An integrated school, for instance, would have people from different ethnic backgrounds in it. Second generation, children who were born in the UK, but their parents were immigrants. And assimilation, immigrants embracing and taking on British values. Multiculturalism, in some ways, is the opposite of assimilation, but they can go one and the same. Multiculturalism is a society where different cultures exist, are vibrant, and live alongside each other in peace and harmony.
So the story of this lesson is the story of race relations between 1957 and 1979. We've already seen some of it in the last exam we did, in lesson 3. So we're now following on from the story of the immigration to see what happens next. And essentially it's one of pain and racism. As the economic situation gets worse during the 60s, the immigrants who were invited over to fill out the manual, low-skilled and undesirable jobs were increasingly resented and disliked, because as people struggled to find jobs, they saw the immigrants as obvious causes of people taking their jobs. And while the government didn't actively like racism, and although it has always stood against racism, it also realized that to get votes it needed to show that it was stopping immigration or reducing immigration. So what happens is the government on one hand tries to ban immigration with various laws, but at the same time says there can be no or little or fewer numbers of immigrants coming over, particularly from certain areas. What we'll find is white immigrants from places like Canada and Australia tragically find it easier to get in here than those from other areas. And this all adds in together to create increasing racial tensions between the white community and immigrant communities, as white communities become increasingly aggressive to the immigrants as they compete for more and more jobs, and immigrant communities become more and more sick of the racism and the second-class citizen nature of their existence, leading to difficulties in integration and an increased disadvantaged nature politically, socially, economically and culturally in British society, and to the point that we find, Dave, where you could argue much of these problems have not changed. So, up until 1957, covered in lesson 3, but just as a recap, immigrant labour from the West Indies and Asia were welcomed over Britain. Britain had full employment, and it didn't have enough people to take the less desirable, less well-paid jobs, generally in London transport or in sort of lower council or jobs and lower council positions, such as garbage men or cleaners, etc. Despite the fact that they're welcomed over by the government, there was strong racist feelings and strong racist beliefs among many native whites. Okay, and it didn't help that many of these immigrants were young men who didn't have the controlling influence of parents, grandparents or wives, which meant that they were often associated with partying, often associated with bad behaviour, and often associated with drunkenness or drug taking. And this is a particular case in areas, particularly poor areas, where the immigrant communities go into. Immigrants obviously can't afford to go into places like Kensington or North London, so instead they congregate in generally the poorer, more deprived areas. And as they get more and more populated in these areas, the white community who lived there before become increasingly resentful.
Now, this lesson really kicks off with an increase in immigration. From 1961 onwards, 130,000 people will enter Britain. That's more than any of the 4 previous years combined. This leads to basically a type of moral panic, a fear of the other, otherwise known as xenophobia. There's a very good word for you. It's the idea when most British people started to look around, and because of the overwhelming numbers of immigrants coming over in 1961 alone and thereafter, people start to look and say, there are a lot of people who do not look or sound or act like me. These people are scary, perhaps they're threatening, and they make sort of the unjustified conclusion that they're threatening traditional British values. So there becomes an increased concern about the face of Britain, if you will, changing. Now, unfortunately, and something that fuels this xenophobia is the fact that economic decline begins at the time when immigration is increasing. Now, we had talked before that throughout the 1950s, as famously said by Harold Macmillan, Brits perhaps never had it so good, but after 1960 onwards, they definitely had it better as the British industry becomes increasingly less competitive. Jobs wither away. They're lost to foreign markets. We're being undercut by Asian markets, in particular the Japanese, and ever increasing volumes by the Chinese. Traditional British industries are shipped overseas or abandoned altogether. Now, white people, white British people, find that, especially amongst the working class unskilled jobs like labor jobs, they're now having to fight for the jobs that are becoming ever smaller in number with people who have moved here recently from other countries. And they start to think, well, that's unfair. Why are these people who aren't like me, who aren't British, coming here and taking what little jobs there are? This will drive anger, especially amongst the British working class. And it will lead to a lot of tensions between white British and obviously Asian or Afro-Caribbean immigrants. And these clashes will come to a head, as Mr. Suter said, in generally working class, cheaper neighborhoods. Just an aside, a lot of you are probably thinking, wait a second, Notting Hill, that's fancy and upper class. Well, interestingly enough, at this point, Notting Hill was a working class neighborhood, and it only recently, maybe thanks to Julia Roberts and Hugh Grant, have become a relatively desirable upper class neighborhood. Social backlash to immigration. 90% of Britons in 1962, when surveyed, demand a curb on immigration. 9/10 of those said they disapprove of mixed marriages, and 80% of Brits agree that there are too many immigrants in Britain already. Alf Garnett, a satirically racist character in a show that's quite famous called Till Death Do Us Part, was widely popular amongst Britons who did not get the satire beyond his racist slogans. And interestingly enough, if you watch To Death Do Us Part from a modern lens, you'll actually see that Alf Garnett is actually relatively advanced for his time. He's poking fun at people like him. But a lot of people didn't get it and thought Alf Garnett became sort of a folk hero amongst sort of the dare I say, white working class. Increasing strikes among groups of workers such as the London dockers against immigration, feeling that white British jobs were being threatened, and they would carry signs like things such as "Keep Britain White" and "No immigrant labor needed." There's also the rise of a group called the National Front. They're an extreme right-wing nationalist party which actively campaigns against immigrants. In many ways, the National Front, the NF for short, is the sort of 1960s precursor to things like the British National Party today, or even to a lesser extent the UKIP or the EDL.
So, in the background of this, where people are getting increasingly concerned and increasingly worried about immigration, the government has to act. If you want to get voted in, you've got to promise to sort out immigration. And we see a wide range of three main immigration acts which are designed to curb immigration. And as they go on, they get more and more strict as governments increasingly try to impress the electorate by showing that they can deal with immigration compared to the other party. So the Tories in 1962 come up with the Commonwealth Immigration Act, which basically means you were not allowed to immigrate unless you had a voucher. Now, to get these vouchers, it was like a raffle. You applied at your local embassy, and if you got it, you got to come over. Now, this was actually harder to get in non-white countries and in the dominions like Canada, Australia, etc. And also, you were far more likely to win the raffle, because it's a separate raffle, if you were a skilled worker compared to an unskilled worker. And again, skilled workers generally came from white backgrounds, whereas the unskilled workers were generally from ethnic minorities.
Let me make a distinction there between skilled and unskilled workers. Now, unskilled workers are people with, generally speaking, perhaps a manual labor as a profession. Farmers would be considered unskilled workers, as would laborers, people who work in factories, or miners. Now, skilled workers are people, generally speaking, with education or degree level certification in a job. It could be so much that the job is in industry, for instance, an engineer, or even certain types of machinists or millwrights have some sort of skilled qualification. But generally speaking, skilled workers are educated, have a particular trade or a degree level certification in something, which of course is unsurprising that disproportionately favors white educated people from relatively rich Commonwealth countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand.
On top of this, in 1968, Labour tries to wave its flag as we are the ones who deal with immigration better. We think today as Labour is the party of pro-immigration. They were the party of the white working class, who are often the most hostile towards immigrants, and so they had no problems limiting immigration. So they banned immigration in the 1968 Commonwealth Immigrants Act for people unless you had a parent or grandparent who was born or naturalised in the UK. This, again, disproportionately allows white individuals from the Commonwealth, again, the same sort of Australia, Canada, whose grandparents must have left to find better work, and they could come back. The word naturalised means those ethnic minorities or those immigrants who have come over to Britain and gotten a British passport also counted for this, which means those early immigrants who got a British passport were also able to bring their parents or their children down as well. This is followed by the Tories again in 1971 trying to wave their flag that they can deal with immigration better than Labour. Okay, and they make it even clearer that naturalisation doesn't count anymore because that allowed too many immigrants to bring their families over, and instead you have to have a British parent or grandparent who was born in the UK. That got rid of a lot of immigrants who had come over and then got a passport afterwards because they were born in their immigrant country, be it Jamaica, Trinidad, or the Asian subcontinent. So all of these free acts are increasing attempts to limit immigration, and despite the fact that they increasingly make it harder to immigrate, people are getting increasingly angry and increasingly concerned about the effects of immigration in the community and the role of immigration in government policy. And what we see is from this, we see that the government has never quite kept people happy. And yes, while they pass these acts, the people want more. If you want to say something, Mr Rainr.
I was just going to say, interestingly enough, the 1971 Immigration Act is still in effect today, and coincidentally, myself as a Canadian am still, I guess, governed by the rules of the 1971 Immigration Act.
So it's not nearly strict enough. Okay, so in 1965...
One might say it has a loophole or two.
In 1965, the government, again, as, not just focused on immigration, also wants to try and ban or make it harder to be racist. So we've got on one hand the government saying we want fewer immigrants, but by the other hand the government also tries to discourage or reduce racism. It's aware that the black communities are becoming increasingly angry that they are being discriminated against and they're being treated as second-class citizens. So they passed the 1965 Race Relations Act. So it was now illegal to discriminate on the basis of race for access to public places. So you were not, so you cannot be discriminated in restaurants. You cannot be discriminated in bars or hotels, okay, or any public services, which is very different to America at the time. However, housing, employment, and many other things, such as just racial abuse, were not outlawed. So you could still employ someone because they're a white, rather than someone because they're black, only based on the basis of their race. And if you said something racist to a black individual, it was nothing special unless it covered another law. So obviously, if you murder someone who's black, that's still murder. But there wouldn't be any offence for just shouting racist abuse in the street to a black person. This is followed, when it's obviously the failures of this and the fact this is not good enough, was followed shortly afterwards in 1968, again by the Labour government, to which bans discrimination for employment and housing. You can't choose your tenants, you can't choose who to give your house to on the basis of their race, and you can't choose who to employ on the basis of their race. And to deal with this, and to deal with complaints, they created the Race Relations Board. And although this is a step forwards, we find that actually only 10% of the complaints they got were upheld, far less than the number which it probably deserved to be. So, in this background, in the 1960s, we see increasing tension.
Okay, so as was alluded to before, and unsurprisingly, the Notting Hill riots of 1958 weren't the end of the tension. That wasn't the release valve that everything went on. The 1960s would see an ever increase in tension, basically coinciding with a growth of extreme right-wing white movements and attacks on immigrants. The hostility towards these immigrants causes a lot of immigrants to band together. Now, for many they were now becoming what we'd call second-generation immigrants, people who have the legitimate claim that we were born here, this is our country, this is the only place we're ever known, facing people who judge them based on the color of their skin and tell them to go home, go back to Africa, go back to the West Indies, go back to Asia where you came from. And they say, well, wait a second, I was born here. I am from here. And as a result of this sort of tension and well, let's be honest, a high level of ignorance, you have a second generation of immigrants who start to form into militant resistance groups. And these resistance groups focus their frustration, their, I guess, hatred, if you will, of the way they've been treated, primarily against police. And there are, again, throughout the 1960s, riots in high immigrant areas. Another riot will break out in Notting Hill.
So this tension from the black community is mirrored from that in the white community. Again, the curbs on immigration does not settle the feeling of amongst white people that there are too many immigrants here. And this is most famously pictured by this chap here, Enoch Powell, at the top behind the Union Jack. And he, in April 1968, he made a very famous speech called the Rivers of Blood speech. And he invoked the image of the Roman Empire, the capital of the Roman Empire, Rome, being overthrown with blood running in the street, and rivers of blood in the Tigris, which is the river which goes through Rome. And what he argued was, if immigration was allowed to continue, and if the level of immigrants inside Britain was continued as well, there would be a race war and death on both sides. Interestingly, he was a conservative member of a conservative shadow cabinet. The shadow cabinet isn't actually the government, they're the people who were in opposition. So the Labour Party is in government, and he's basically a senior Tory in opposition. Despite this, he's immediately fired from the shadow cabinet and attacked in the press, particularly amongst the broadsheet. And if you remember back to the media lesson, the broadsheets are the more sensible, sort of more focus on newspapers as opposed to tabloids like the Sun and the Mirror. So although his prediction that there should be no more immigration and that the role of different cultures in Britain was for the worse, and although he was kicked out of government and he was pillared by some members of the community, actually it's increasingly clear that his words were supported by the vast majority of Britons. If we have a look, after he was forced from office, he received over 43,000 letters of support from usually working class individuals. Often these people are fighting for jobs at the very bottom, or living in the same areas as these immigrant communities, and they were bewildered and alarmed by what they see as increasing foreign influence over their lives. And in addition, even better, and at the end of April, so this is days after he actually made the speech, 74% of people asked agreed with his view. So it's not as easy to say that, well, he got fired and people were angry for him to say this. His view was the popular one. And that's very important to realize. Yes, we've got the Race Relations Act to try and push through change, but in reality, the vast majority of people towards the end of 1960s and start of 1970s were still racist or held negative views towards immigrants. And this shows how controversial immigration is even throughout the 1970s going forward.
Now, I guess the question remains, to what degree did immigrants hold on to the way they used to do things, or to what degree did they assimilate? Did they just mold themselves into modern British society? And I mean, it's reasonable to suspect, and it's correct to suspect, that second generation immigrant children were more likely to challenge the cultural practices of their parents, having been sort of brought up in an environment of British ideas and British norms. Now, that didn't necessarily mean all second-generation immigrants assimilated. Of course, the various cultural differences keep cultures apart, regardless of the fact that they understand British customs or not. Of course, varying marriage laws, food laws being another way, show a degree of difference, and meant that, you know, not everybody came over and started eating roast beef on Sunday. Okay, there were just things that people held on to, and they've led to a sort of the growth of what we call today multicultural Britain. Multicultural Britain was something, and I think importantly, picked up by the media first. Now, the media is really, I mean, it's progressive in terms of pushing forward pop culture. It's also relatively progressive in terms of immigration. I talked a little bit a little while ago about the TV show
Death Do Us Part.
Till Death Do Us Part. But there are all sorts of other examples at the time where in media, immigrants are portrayed usually positively. And as a result, more British people start to accept immigration as a norm. Some assimilate, some immigrants join the cultural milieu, but more often and more commonly, Britain turns from a relatively white society into a society that's becoming very distinguished and distinguishingly multicultural. Now, think about cuisine and the British palate. Before 1960, there are only a handful of Indian restaurants. I mean, famously, Veeraswamy, which is on Regent Street, was the first Indian restaurant in the capital, and that was only opened in the 1930s. Now, let's take Indian food as an example. It's probably Britain's #1 food. I mean, if you ask anybody what do the British eat, people say curry, and that has a lot to do with the multiculturalism of the 1960s. On the flip side, though, it's important to remember that even though there is some assimilation in Britain, it is becoming a little bit more multicultural because of this. Immigrant communities disproportionately occupy poor employment, and they are, generally speaking, lower class neighborhoods with poor housing, poor social programs, poor schools in that neighborhood. This feeds what's known as a cycle of poverty. You're born into it, you can't escape it, you enter into it, your kids enter into it, and it basically continues on like that. Underachievement at school usually follows, poor job prospects come as a result, and these are the issues that in many ways we still deal with today in poor areas.
So, when we look at the level of assimilation and multiculturalism, it's fairly clear that despite the fact the government quite actively wants the races to get together, mainly just because it will allow for more public order for both sides, many Britons retained their racist views. And this is basically because it's very difficult to change people's views. Now, where there is change, it's the younger generation. The younger generation versus this generation of the 60s, so they're about freedom, equality and love, and therefore they quite like the anti-racist message. Also, many of them will be going to school with individuals from immigrant backgrounds, so they will be more humanized. It's very easy to hate an immigrant if you've never really met one, whereas actually if most of your friends growing up were immigrants, you know their story and you know that they're human like everyone else, and therefore you're more likely to give them the benefit of doubt. And this is why today we see a far more accepting, or on the surface of it at least, a far more accepting attitude towards ethnic minorities and people who have immigrated over to the UK. But that takes time to take across, and as the older generation, with want of a better word, dies out, and the younger generation becomes more and more popular, and there seems to be more and more of them, we see a shift in that. But by the end of this course, 1979, the vast majority of people around were not used to immigrants being in the country, and those who were generally younger. And this shows a split in the views between working class, older generations, and people in the regions, people who either are in competition for jobs and housing and living in the same areas of the immigrants' communities, older generations who are never really gotten used to immigration and maybe have outdated views are based on the empire of the role of immigrants and the role of the British Empire and its relation to its colonial subjects, and also people who haven't really ever had an exposure to immigrants. The immigrants they hear a lot about in the news and they hear a lot of problems with, because obviously the news reports a lot of negative things about immigration, but haven't really met an immigrant or many immigrants to actually form a judgment on. Okay, so so it's important to understand that yes, you can't say the entire country is racist. It's very dependent on who they are. And there's an interesting question: see, how far has this been fixed even to this day, or how far do we find that there are pockets of racism amongst certain groups, generations, and areas? So, to sum up,
have things got better 1957 to 1979, Mr. Suter?
No, they got angrier. They got more aggressive. I would say overall, there's far more tension by 1979 compared to 1957. And while there is some shift, and there are middle classes are increasingly tolerating immigrant communities, partly because they're not competing for the same jobs or the houses, because the immigrants are, completely different bracket housing-wise and job-wise. And although the younger generation are increasingly accepting immigrant communities, I would say actually overall the fact that the experience of immigrants and the experience of white people around immigration and around integration is overwhelmingly negative. And this can be seen by the fact that pretty much year on year in the mid to late 70s, in fact that's what I did my dissertation part on at university, there was non-stop riots pretty much year on year at Notting Hill after Notting Hill Carnival. And there was problems in Lewisham, problems in Toxteth, problems in Tottenham, problems up in Liverpool and up in Bradford as well. And this shows not only that this problem hadn't been solved, but white people are becoming increasingly angry and worried, and people from immigrant communities are becoming increasingly sick of the racism they are getting.
Let me ask you another question then. If government's role is to make the lives of citizens better, did government help or hinder the progress of race relations 1957 to 1979?
Without a shadow of a doubt, the government, by trying to play a dual role, hard on immigrants but trying to reduce racism, in reality they do a far better job on the vote winner, which is reducing immigration, than encouraging integration. And we should look upon the Race Relations Board as a weak attempt to reduce racism and reduce racism in society. Because if the government tried to actively do any more to change the minds of the people, they would often get not voted in, and they would next election they would not get voted in. And most elections, side note, you might not really need to know, but the elections in 1966, 1970, 1974, and 19 October 1974 were all decided by a couple of seats. They cannot afford the political problems and the political hatred that will be caused by a far more pro-immigrant, pro-race relations stance.
No, one more question. Can you consider Britain in 1979, which it clearly wasn't in 1957, is Britain, at the end of this period in 1979, a multicultural society?
It would depend how you define it. There's increasing acceptance of different cultures. And it's very clear in certain areas and certain communities there is toleration. However, I would say a multicultural society denotes an idea that the society is at ease with all these different cultures being part of it. And actually that's really not the case. Yes, there are more Indian restaurants, but the language used, even to describe these Indian restaurants, is overwhelmingly racist. And if you look at films from the time even, or recounts from the time, they don't describe them as Indian restaurants. They use racist slurs to describe them. They don't treat the waiters or the owners with respect. Or when they do, it turns out that immigrant is the exception. And what we find actually is that this is a Britain with lots of cultures, but these cultures are not in line. And you can argue if that's even changed to this day, but either way you argue it, it was far worse today, and both sides were far more worried and far more angry and far less likely and far less willing to agree.
So, as you can see, the story of race relations 1957 to 1979 is a complex one.
And a sad one.
And a sad one. And it's something that I think we're still dealing with today. We will see you next lesson. For Mr. Suter and myself, good luck. Good evening.
Good luck.
We said that already.
Did we?